My name is Detective A. Marcus Thompson, and I have been serving with the New York City Police Department for 28 years. In nearly 3 decades of investigating crimes, I have encountered every type of criminal imaginable. But sometimes, you meet someone whose story forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about landlord corruption, fire safety negligence, and what happens when a person dedicated to saving lives watches 8 people, including 3 children, burned to death because a wealthy property owner valued profits over human safety. This is the story that David Collins told me 19 months ago, sitting in an interrogation room after being arrested for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, breaking and entering, and conspiracy. When David first began speaking, I expected to hear another tale of revenge-driven crime. Instead, I heard a confession that made me question everything I thought I knew about building safety regulations and how easily corrupt landlords can escape justice even after causing multiple deaths. David Collins was 48 years old when he committed the crimes that brought him to my attention. But to understand why David became a criminal, you have to understand the firefighter he once was and how one horrific night in a burning apartment building destroyed not just 8 innocent lives, but also David's faith in the system he had served for 2 decades. David had wanted to be a firefighter since he was 7 years old when firefighters rescued him and his mother from a house fire in their Queens neighborhood. He remembered watching these brave men carry him down a ladder through smoke and flames and thinking that he wanted to spend his life doing the same thing for other people. David joined the New York City Fire Department when he was 23 years old, fresh out of the fire academy and eager to prove himself. He was assigned to Engine Company 47 in the Bronx, one of the busiest firehouses in the city. The Bronx had high rates of poverty, substandard housing, and frequent fires that kept David and his fellow firefighters constantly responding to emergencies. Detective Thompson, David said, his voice filled with the passion he had once felt for his profession. I loved being a firefighter. Every day was different. Every call was a chance to help someone, and every life we saved reminded me why I had chosen this career. It was dangerous and exhausting, but it was the most meaningful work I could imagine doing. David quickly gained a reputation as one of the most dedicated and skilled firefighters in his company. He was fearless when entering burning buildings, always volunteering to go in first and search for victims. He had an instinct for reading fire behavior and could anticipate when a structure was about to collapse or when flashover was imminent. Over 20 years, David participated in hundreds of fire responses and personally saved dozens of lives. He pulled unconscious children from smoke-filled bedrooms, carried elderly residents down burning staircases, and performed CPR on victims who had stopped breathing. His colleagues respected him, and his supervisors consistently praised his work. David married his high school sweetheart, Isabel, when he was 25, and they had 2 sons named Lucas and Benjamin. Isabel worked as a nurse and understood the demands and dangers of David's job. The family lived in a modest house in Yonkers, and while money was always tight, they were happy and proud of the work David did. For 20 years, David lived what most people would consider a fulfilling and honorable life. He served his community, saved lives, and came home to a family that loved him. He had achieved his childhood dream of becoming a firefighter and was making a real difference in people's lives every time he responded to an emergency. But on a cold February night in 2021, everything changed in a way that would destroy David's career, his faith in justice, and ultimately his entire sense of who he was. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. reporting a structure fire at the Riverside Apartments, a 6-story residential building in the South Bronx. David and Engine Company 47 responded within 4 minutes, arriving to find heavy smoke and flames pouring from multiple windows on the 3rd and 4th floors. The Riverside Apartments was a building that David and his fellow firefighters knew well. They had responded to numerous calls there over the years, including smaller fires, maintenance emergencies, and medical calls. The building housed about 80 families, mostly recent immigrants and low-income workers, who could not afford better housing. When David and his team arrived at the scene, they immediately began evacuating residents from the lower floors, while other companies set up ladder operations to rescue people trapped on upper floors. The fire was spreading rapidly, much faster than it should have in a building, with proper fire safety systems. Detective Thompson, David told me, his voice taking on a haunted quality. We could hear people screaming from the upper floors. Residents were hanging out of windows begging us to help them. We worked as fast as we could, but the building was a death trap. The fire spread through the walls and ceilings like it was designed to burn. David and 2 other firefighters made entry into the building and began searching for victims. They found several residents unconscious from smoke inhalation and carried them out to waiting paramedics. But the fire was moving faster than they could search, and eventually the incident commander ordered everyone out because the building was becoming structurally unstable. The fire burned for over 3 hours before it was finally brought under control. When the smoke cleared and firefighters could re-enter the building to search for victims, they discovered 8 bodies. 3 were children. Under the age of 10, 2 were elderly residents, and 3 were young adults who had been trapped by the rapidly spreading fire. David was one of the firefighters who helped recover the bodies, and he would never forget the sight of those 3 children who had died huddled together in a corner trying to escape the smoke and flames. They were sisters aged 4, 7, and 9 who had been home alone while their parents worked night shifts. The tragedy devastated the entire fire department and the community. 8 people had died in a residential building fire in a city that was supposed to have strict fire codes and safety regulations. The media covered the story extensively, and city officials promised a thorough investigation into what had gone wrong. The fire marshal's investigation revealed horrifying negligence on the part of the building's owner. The Riverside Apartments had no working fire alarm system, despite this being required by law. The emergency exit doors on several floors had been chained shut by building management to prevent residents from using the roof for gatherings. The fire sprinkler system had been deliberately disabled to avoid the cost of maintaining it. Most damningly, the investigation found that the building had failed multiple fire safety inspections over the previous 5 years, but the violations had never been properly enforced. The building's owner had simply paid small fines and continued operating without making the required safety improvements. The building's owner was a wealthy real estate developer named Richard Ventura, who owned over 50 residential properties throughout the Bronx and Manhattan. Richard had built his fortune by purchasing old buildings in poor neighborhoods and renting them to low-income tenants while spending as little as possible on maintenance and safety improvements. Richard was known in real estate circles as a slumlord who maximized profits by ignoring building codes and using his connections to corrupt city inspectors. He had been sued numerous times by tenants over unsafe living conditions, but he had teams of lawyers who settled cases quietly and kept him out of serious legal trouble. Detective Thompson David said, when I learned that the building owner had deliberately disabled the fire safety systems to save money, I felt a rage unlike anything I had experienced in my career. Those 8 people, including 3 little girls, had died because one wealthy man decided that their lives were worth less than the cost of maintaining basic safety equipment. David testified at the criminal trial of Richard Ventura, who was charged with 8 counts of criminally negligent homicide, along with numerous building code violations. David described in detail what he had seen when responding to the fire, how the lack of fire alarms and locked emergency exits had prevented residents from escaping, and how the disabled sprinkler system had allowed the fire to spread unchecked. David expected that Richard would be convicted and sent to prison for causing 8 deaths through his deliberate negligence. The evidence was overwhelming, and there seemed to be no way that Richard could escape responsibility for what had happened. But Richard Ventura had resources that the victims and their families could never match. He hired a team of the most expensive defense attorneys in New York who crafted a defense strategy that blamed everyone except Richard for the fire deaths. The defense attorneys argued that the fire had been caused by a resident's negligence, specifically a man who had fallen asleep while cooking and whose unattended stove had started the blaze. They claimed that even with working fire alarms and sprinkler systems, the fire had spread so quickly that nothing could have prevented the deaths. Most devastatingly, the defense team attacked David and the fire department, claiming that firefighters had responded too slowly and had not been aggressive enough in their search and rescue efforts. They brought in expert witnesses who testified that with faster response times and better tactics, all 8 victims could have been saved. The defense strategy was cynical and dishonest, but it was effective at creating doubt in the minds of jurors. Richard's attorneys painted him as a struggling small business owner trying to provide affordable housing, while David and his fellow firefighters were portrayed as incompetent public employees looking for someone to blame for their own failures. The trial lasted 6 weeks and the jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict. Richard Ventura was found not guilty on all counts of criminally negligent homicide. He was convicted only of minor building code violations and fined $50,000, a sum that was meaningless to a man worth millions of dollars. David sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read and felt his entire worldview shatter. 8 people had died because Richard Ventura deliberately disabled fire safety systems, and Richard was walking out of the courtroom a free man. Worse, David and his fellow firefighters had been publicly blamed for the deaths by Richard's defense team. The impact on David was immediate and profound. He became consumed with anger at the injustice of what had happened. He could not sleep without seeing the faces of those 3 little girls who had died huddled together in a corner. He could not work without thinking about how Richard Ventura was living in luxury while 8 families mourned their dead loved ones. David's colleagues tried to support him, but he withdrew from everyone at the firehouse. His relationship with Isabel deteriorated as he became increasingly angry and obsessed with the case. His sons Lucas and Benjamin tried to connect with their father, but David was emotionally unavailable, unable to focus on anything except his rage at Richard Ventura. 6 months after the trial, David was involved in an incident at a fire scene where he lost his temper and got into a physical confrontation with a battalion chief who criticized his performance. The incident resulted in David being placed on administrative leave pending a disciplinary hearing. The fire department's internal investigation recommended that David be terminated for his conduct. They noted that his performance had declined significantly since the Riverside Apartments fire and that his anger issues made him a liability. David was given the option to resign rather than be fired, and he accepted, knowing that his career as a firefighter was over. At age 47, after spending 24 years saving lives and serving his community, David Collins found himself unemployed and struggling with severe depression and post-traumatic stress. He had lost his career, his sense of purpose, and his faith that justice existed for people without wealth and power. Isabel tried to help David through this dark period, but eventually the strain on their marriage became too much. She filed for separation, citing David's inability to move past his anger and his refusal to seek professional help for his mental health issues. Isabel took Lucas and Benjamin and moved to her sister's house, leaving David alone in their house. David spent months in this dark place, barely eating, barely sleeping, and constantly replaying the night of the Riverside Apartments. Fire in his mind, he kept a folder containing news articles about the fire trial transcripts and photographs of the 8 victims, especially the 3 sisters, who had died together. Detective Thompson David told me, "I spent months in that house obsessing over the injustice of what had happened. I kept thinking about those 3 little girls and how they died because Richard Ventura valued money more than their lives. I kept thinking about how he had blamed us for failing to save them, when he had created the conditions that made their deaths inevitable." But gradually, David's depression began to transform into something more focused and dangerous. He started researching Richard Ventura, learning about his business empire, his other properties, and his history of skirting building codes and exploiting tenants. David discovered that the Riverside Apartments was not an isolated case, but part of a pattern of deliberate neglect across all of Richard's properties. David learned that Richard owned 52 residential buildings throughout New York City, housing over 3,000 tenants. Investigations into these buildings revealed that nearly all of them had serious fire safety violations, including disabled or missing sprinkler systems, non-functioning fire alarms locked, emergency exits, and inadequate fire escapes. Tenants had been complaining about these conditions for years, but their complaints were ignored by building management and rarely resulted in meaningful enforcement action from city agencies. Richard had created a system where he could maximize profits by neglecting safety while using his political connections. and legal resources to avoid serious consequences. David also discovered that Richard had been systematically bribing city building inspectors to overlook violations or issue passing grades for buildings that should have failed inspections. The corruption extended throughout the system, with inspectors housing department officials and even some fire department administrators receiving payments to look the other way. This revelation crystallized something in David's mind. Richard Ventura was not going to be held accountable through the legal system because the system itself was corrupt. If David wanted justice for the 8 people who had died at Riverside Apartments and for the thousands of tenants still living in unsafe conditions in Richard's buildings, David would have to take matters into his own hands. David Collins was going to expose Richard Ventura's empire of slumlord properties and corrupt officials, even if it meant becoming a criminal himself. The firefighter who had spent his career-saving lives was about to become someone who would break any law necessary to prevent future deaths and honor the memory of 8 people who had died because one man valued profits over human safety. David spent 9 months planning his campaign to expose Richard Ventura with the same methodical approach he had once used to assess fire scenes and plan rescue operations. He studied Richard's business structure, identified vulnerabilities in how the properties were managed, and researched corporate espionage and investigative journalism techniques that would allow him to gather irrefutable evidence. Most importantly, David created a false identity that would allow him to gain access to Richard's properties and business operations without anyone connecting him to the Riverside Apartments fire or recognizing him as the terminated firefighter who had testified against Richard. Detective Thompson David told me, his voice taking on the calculating tone that characterized his transformation. I became Nathan Pierce, a fire safety consultant who specialized in helping property owners comply with building codes and pass inspections. I grew a beard, changed my hairstyle, and adopted different mannerisms. Even people from my old firehouse would not have recognized me as David Collins. David's false identity was carefully constructed with fake credentials, a professional website, and references from companies that he had researched thoroughly. He created a backstory showing Nathan Pierce as a former fire marshal who had started his own consulting business helping landlords avoid violations and fines. The position David targeted was not direct employment, but rather offering his consulting services to Richard Ventura's property management company. David cold called the company, offering to conduct comprehensive fire safety audits of all their buildings and help them address violations before official inspectors found them. Richard's property management team was initially skeptical, but David's knowledge of fire codes and his apparent understanding of how to work the system impressed them. They agreed to hire Nathan Pierce to audit 5 of their buildings as a trial run, with the possibility of expanding to their entire portfolio if the results were satisfactory. For the first 3 months, David focused on being an excellent consultant. He conducted thorough inspections, identified real fire safety issues, and provided detailed reports with recommendations for addressing violations. He built relationships with property managers, maintenance staff, and even had several meetings with Richard Ventura himself. David told me that being in the same room with Richard Ventura and maintaining his false identity required extraordinary self-control. He had to act like a friendly consultant while sitting across from the man responsible for 8 deaths, including 3 children whose faces haunted. Detective Thompson David said, every time I met with Richard Ventura or toured one of his buildings and saw the dangerous conditions his tenants were living in, I had to remind myself to stay calm and stick to my plan. I wanted to confront him immediately, but I knew that patience and thorough documentation would be more effective than emotional accusations. As David gained trust and access to more properties, he began documenting every fire safety violation, every bribe paid to inspectors, and every instance where Richard's company deliberately chose profits over tenant safety. He carried hidden cameras and recording devices, meticulously gathering evidence that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. David discovered that the situation was even worse than he had initially suspected. All 52 of Richard's buildings had serious fire safety violations, and at least 30 of them had conditions as dangerous as the Riverside Apartments had been. Richard was operating a systematic scheme where he maximized occupancy and rent revenue while spending almost nothing on safety, equipment, or building maintenance. The evidence David gathered showed that Richard had paid over $200,000 in bribes to city building inspectors over a 5-year period. These inspectors would either skip inspections entirely or issue passing reports for buildings with obvious violations. The corruption involved at least 15 different inspectors across 3 city agencies. David also documented how Richard's company intimidated tenants who complained about conditions. Residents who reported violations to authorities would face retaliation, including unjustified eviction, proceedings, rent increases, and threats of reporting undocumented family members to immigration authorities. Most disturbingly, David found evidence that there had been other fires at Richard's properties that could have been prevented with proper safety systems. In the 10 years before the Riverside Apartments fire, there had been 4 other fires at Richard's buildings that resulted in injuries and 1 previous death. Each time Richard had settled lawsuits quietly and continued operating without making meaningful safety improvements. Detective Thompson David told me Richard Ventura had been getting away with this for over a decade. He had created a business model based on exploiting poor tenants and bribing officials while putting thousands of lives at risk. The Riverside Apartments fire was not an aberration. It was an inevitable result of his deliberate negligence. After 9 months of investigation, David had compiled thousands of pages of documentation, including inspection reports, photographs of violations, audio recordings of Richard discussing bribes, and financial records showing payments to corrupt inspectors. But David knew that simply turning this evidence over to authorities might not be enough given how corrupt the system was. David decided that he needed to create a public exposure campaign that would generate so much media attention and public outrage that authorities would be forced to act. He needed to make Richard Ventura's corruption impossible to ignore or cover up. David created packages containing different subsets of evidence tailored for specific audiences. He sent comprehensive documentation to federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office who would not be subject to the local corruption that had protected Richard. He provided evidence to investigative journalism, teams at major newspapers and television stations. He sent detailed reports to tenant advocacy organizations and housing rights groups. But before releasing all this evidence, David wanted Richard Ventura to understand exactly who had exposed him and why. He arranged a final meeting with Richard under the pretense of presenting his complete fire safety audit of all 52 buildings. When David entered Richard's office for this meeting, he brought a folder containing photographs of the 8 victims from the Riverside Apartments fire. He placed the photographs on Richard's desk and began speaking in his normal voice, dropping the persona of Nathan Pierce. "My name is not Nathan Pierce," David said calmly. "My real name is David Collins, and I was one of the firefighters who responded to the Riverside Apartments fire 3 years ago." Richard's expression changed from confusion to recognition as he realized that his trusted fire safety consultant was actually the firefighter who had testified against him during his trial. "You killed 8 people," David continued, "including 3 little girls who died together because you disabled the fire alarms and locked the emergency exits to save money. You blame me and my fellow firefighters for their deaths, but we both know the truth." David then explained in detail the evidence he had gathered over 9 months showing the extent of Richard's criminal enterprise. He described the bribes to inspectors, the dangerous conditions in all 52 buildings, the intimidation of tenants, and the pattern of fires that Richard's negligence had caused. Richard tried to respond with threats and legal warnings, but David cut him off. "Everything I just described is documented with photographs, audio, recordings, and financial records," David said. "I have spent 9 months gathering evidence that will destroy your business and send you to federal prison, and I have already sent all of it to prosecutors, journalists, and tenant advocates." David stood up and placed one more photograph on Richard's desk. It showed the 3 sisters who had died at Riverside Apartments smiling and playing together before the fire. "Those are the Morales sisters," David said. "Carmen, age 9, Lucia, age 7, and Sophia, age 4. They died because you valued money more than their lives. I want you to look at their faces and remember them when you are sitting in federal prison." David walked out of Richard's office and waited for the consequences of his actions to unfold. Within 48 hours, federal agents raided Richard Ventura's business offices and multiple properties, seizing computers, files, and financial records. The FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office launched a comprehensive criminal investigation. Major news outlets began publishing devastating investigative reports based on the evidence David had provided. The stories detailed Richard's systematic neglect of fire safety, his bribery of city officials, and the dangerous conditions that thousands of tenants were living in. The reports included photographs of violations, audio of Richard discussing bribes, and interviews with tenants who described years of complaining about unsafe conditions. The publicity created immediate consequences for Richard and for the corrupt system that had enabled him. The mayor announced a comprehensive audit of all city building inspections. Multiple building inspectors were suspended and eventually fired for accepting bribes. The building's department commissioner resigned under pressure. Richard Ventura was arrested and charged with multiple federal crimes, including bribery, conspiracy, fraud, and violations of federal housing safety laws. The federal charges were more serious than the state charges he had beaten at his previous trial, and this time he would not be able to use his local political connections to escape justice. Most significantly, the U.S. attorney filed charges of criminally negligent homicide under federal law for the 8 deaths at Riverside Apartments. Federal prosecutors argued that Richard's systematic pattern of safety, violations, and bribery constituted reckless disregard for human life that directly caused the deaths. Richard's trial lasted 7 months and became a national story about slumlord corruption, housing inequality, and how the wealthy exploit the poor while endangering their lives. Dozens of tenants testified about the conditions they had endured in Richard's buildings. Fire safety experts explained how Richard's deliberate disabling of safety systems had made the Riverside Apartments fire inevitable. David testified again, but this time his testimony was supported by the comprehensive evidence he had gathered during his 9 months working undercover. The photographs, recordings, and documents made it impossible for Richard's defense team to shift blame to firefighters or claim that the violations were minor or unintentional. Richard Ventura was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His real estate empire was dismantled, with all 52 buildings being seized and sold to nonprofit housing organizations that would actually maintain them properly. Richard was also ordered to pay $10 million in restitution to the families of fire victims and tenants who had suffered from his negligence. But David's campaign to expose Richard had required him to commit crimes that eventually caught the attention of law enforcement. His creation of a false identity to gain access to buildings was fraud and trespassing. His use of hidden cameras and recording devices violated privacy laws. His breaking into offices to photograph documents was burglary. Federal prosecutors appreciated that David had exposed genuine crimes and corruption, but they could not ignore that he had broken multiple laws in the process. David was arrested and charged with identity theft, fraud, trespassing, illegal surveillance, and burglary. Detective Thompson, David said during our final interview, "People ask me if I regret what I did to Richard Ventura. The answer is absolutely not. He killed 8 people, including 3 innocent children, and he would have continued putting lives at risk if someone had not exposed him. He deserved everything that happened to him." David paused, looking at the walls of the interrogation room. "But I do regret that I had to become a criminal to get justice for those 8 victims. I spent 24 years as a firefighter, dedicated to saving lives and following the law. I never imagined that I would end up breaking into buildings and creating false identities. But when the legal system completely failed those victims, I realized that sometimes the only way to protect people is to break the rules." David looked at me with eyes that still held both the dedicated firefighter he had been and the vigilante investigator he had become. "The worst part, Detective Thompson, is that even after sending Richard to prison and forcing reforms in the building inspection system, those 8 people are still dead. Nothing I did brought back Carmen Lucia and Sofia Morales, or the 5 other people who died that night. All I did was prove that the system had failed them and try to prevent it from failing others." As our interview concluded, I found myself grappling with questions that have no easy answers. David Collins had committed serious crimes, including fraud identity, theft, and illegal surveillance. By any legal standard, he was a criminal who deserved to be punished for his actions. But the corruption David had exposed was real and had directly caused 8 deaths with thousands, more tenants living in conditions that could have killed them at any moment. Richard Ventura had escaped justice once, through wealth and legal maneuvering, and would likely have continued his dangerous practices without David's illegal investigation. David's trial became another chapter in the ongoing debate about when, if ever, vigilante justice is acceptable. Firefighter unions and tenant advocacy groups rallied to his defense, arguing that he was a hero who had sacrificed his career and freedom to protect vulnerable people that the system had abandoned. The prosecution argued that David's crimes were serious and systematic, spanning 9 months and involving multiple felonies. They pointed out that his illegal surveillance had violated the privacy rights of many innocent people, and that his breaking into offices could have compromised other ongoing investigations. The jury convicted David on multiple counts but recommended leniency in sentencing. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. It was a relatively moderate sentence, given the extent of his crimes, but the judge acknowledged that David's motivations had been to protect public safety rather than personal gain. David Collins sits in federal prison today, serving his sentence for crimes he committed in pursuit of justice for 8 fire victims. He spends his days working in the prison's vocational training program, teaching other inmates about fire safety and building codes. Even in prison, David cannot stop trying to protect people from fire hazards. Richard Ventura also sits in federal prison, serving 25 years for his crimes. He has lost his wealth, his business empire, and his freedom. His name has become synonymous with slumlord, corruption, and the callous exploitation of vulnerable tenants. The 8 victims of the Riverside Apartments fire are buried in cemeteries across the Bronx. The Morales sisters, Carmen, Lucia, and Sophia, are buried together with a headstone paid for by the firefighters of Engine Company 47. The headstone reads 3. Angels taken too soon, never forgotten. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, David's former colleagues hold a memorial ceremony at the site. The case of David Collins and Richard Ventura serves as a stark reminder of how corruption and greed can turn housing into death traps for poor families. When landlords value profits over safety, and when officials can be bribed to overlook violations, the consequences can be fatal. Sometimes the only people willing to fight for justice are those who have already lost everything to an unjust system. And sometimes protecting the vulnerable requires breaking the very laws meant to protect them. David Collins was a dedicated firefighter who believed in serving his community and following the rules. But when the system failed 8 fire victims, including 3 little girls, David became something else, a criminal investigator who would break any law necessary to prevent future deaths and honor the memory of people who died because one wealthy man decided their lives were not worth the cost of basic safety equipment. If this story affected you, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime confessions. Until then, remember that the heroes who protect us may one day need us to fight for them when systems fail.